Hello, welcome to another episode of Pursuit of the Paranormal podcast. It's me, Greg Tomlinson. Hope you're well. Ash isn't feeling great, he's a bit under weather at the moment, so I'm taking the reins. So, I'm going to cover off a topic that is close to my heart, is something that I covered off in a previous episode, which is poltergeists. So, I have recently done a talk at ASAP where I spoke about the relationship between poltergeist activity and UAPs. I'm not going to cover it off in that much detail today, but I would like to cover off some of the talk that I did where I spoke about the emotional triggers that can cause paranormal and poltergeist activity. So, over the years, I've been part of many investigations, as you'll well know, and spoken to countless experiences. And if you listen to the podcast, you'll know me and Ash speak to loads of people all the time. I've spoken to researchers and skeptics. And one of the type of cases that consistently stand out for me because of its unpredictability, although it's quite chaotic, it does weirdly have a pattern and the emotional intensity is the poltergeist. The Enfield poltergeist was actually the first ghost story I saw on TV. I was about 8 years old, watching Arthur C. Clarke's World of Mysteries on um, BBC, I think it was, back in the day when we had the three channels. For those people who wouldn't have a clue what that's all about, I was petrified but absolutely glued to the screen. How could something that was invisible cause so much chaos in a family's life, but the next door neighbour or neighbours not experience any of it? I was spellbound, and it sent me on my paranormal journey for almost 40 years so far. Poltergeist cases are often misunderstood, though. People tend to lump all paranormal activity into one type of category, and that's hauntings. But there's a crucial difference between a haunting and a poltergeist. A haunting is typically passive and repetitive, like a recording. You might see apparitions in the same place, hear footsteps at the same time every night, or witness the same light flickering without interaction. Hauntings are usually tied to a location and often don't have a conscious entity at all. Poltergeist activity, on the other hand, is active, physical, and it's escalating. It's typically focused on a person, not a place, and it can involve everything from knocks and bangs to objects being thrown, furniture being overturned, and electronics being affected. In this episode, I want to explore poltergeist through a different lens, one that doesn't point the finger outwards at spirits but inward at us. I want to touch on the connection between poltergeist activity and emotional triggers. It's a connection that only since been hosting the podcast have we seen, um, and it's something where psychological stress, grief, and emotional repression may not just influence paranormal events, but may actually be the source and the reason for their happening. Let's start by breaking down what we actually mean by the word poltergeist. The term comes from the German poltern, meaning to make noise, and Geist, meaning spirit. Together, a noisy ghost. But in the paranormal field, the label means much more than just bangs in the night. Poltergeist activity is defined by a set of physical disturbances that appear to occur without a known cause. These include loud, repeated knocking or rapping sounds, objects flying across a room, sometimes in full view of witnesses, furniture being overturned or dragged, lights flickering on and off, phones ringing with no one on the line or technology behaving erratically, and fires breaking out spontaneously. The common theme is water appearing from nowhere, puddles on the floor, dripping ceilings with no leaks, and in some rare cases, bodily harm. People report being scratched, shoved, or even bitten, often without what's seen the cause. But what makes poltergeists especially intriguing and unsettling is this. They're not usually tied to a location, they're tied to a person. That person, often a teenager or someone going through emotional upheaval, becomes the focus of the activity. In parapsychology, they're called the agent, and crucially, they're completely unaware that they're involved at all. So, a question for you. If a chair flies across a room, but no one sees it, is it paranormal? Or is it the context that makes it matter? This is what sets poltergeist cases apart from your classic residual hauntings. Residual hauntings, as mentioned, are like recordings. A figure walks the same hallway at the same time, a door slams every night. There's often no awareness or response from the entity. Poltergeists, on the other hand, are interactive, escalating, and emotional. They react to people, they target specific individuals. They get louder, more destructive, and more frequent, and then often they stop just as suddenly as they began, usually when the emotional pressure is released or the agent leaves the environment. So let's look at a few famous cases that exemplify this pattern. The first one is the Enfield poltergeist from North London from 1977, perhaps the UK's most famous poltergeist case and my personal favourite as well. The activity centred on 11-year-old Janet Hodgson and her sister Margaret. It began with furniture moving on its own, knocking sounds, and toys being thrown across the room. Things escalated quickly. Drawers were pulled out by invisible hands. Heavy dressers tipped over, and family members were reportedly levitated. Janet, in particular, began speaking in a deep, gravelly male voice, claiming to be the man named Bill Wilkins, later matched to a real person who died in the house. Police officers, neighbours, and journalists all witnessed strange occurrences. The case drew researchers from the Society for Psychical Research, including Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair, who documented extensive phenomena over 18 months. Although some suspected trickery and Janet admitted to faking a few incidents, the volume, consistency, and range of phenomena led many to believe that there was something genuine at play. Whether it's spiritual, psychological, or both, Enfield remains one of the most well documented and fiercely debated cases in modern paranormal history. The Rosenheim poltergeist next to Bavaria in Germany in 1967. This case took place in a law office where phones rang repeatedly without connection, light fixtures swung violently, and fluorescent tubes exploded. Even the heavy office furniture reportedly rotated and shifted on its own. The strange phenomena were witnessed not only by the staff but also by technicians, police, and journalists. Investigations were carried out by Hans Bender, a prominent parapsychologist. He found that disturbances often occurred when the 19-year-old secretary named Anne-Marie Schneider was present and ceased when she was absent. What made Rosenheim different was the involvement of engineers from the phone company and power authorities who confirmed unusual activity and electrical anomalies that could not be explained by faulty wiring or equipment. The events were even caught on film. This case stands out because of its scientific documentation and because one of the rare cases where environmental interference was proven but still unexplainable. The Battersea Poltergeist. The lesser known, although not so lesser known now, but deeply disturbing case followed a teenager named Shirley Hitchens who lived in a modest home in Battersea with her family. It began when Shirley received a strange silver key that no one could identify. Shortly after the disturbances began, knocks echoed through the house. In response to questions, furniture moved on its own. Loud crashes were heard in the night. Clothes were torn apart. Messages appeared on the walls. And the family named the presence Donald. The case escalated to the point where the BBC became involved and Shirley was even featured in national newspapers. Paranormal researcher Harold Shibett investigated the case for years and kept detailed journals. Donald's presence was disruptive but oddly personal. He developed an apparent obsession with Shirley, sometimes protective, sometimes aggressive. The case became deeply entwined with her emotional life. Battersea is a unique case because of its longevity. It lasted over a decade, grown in complexity, and left Shirley psychologically scarred for much of her adult life. Many now view the case as an extended poltergeist episode fueled by a mix of teenage energy, emotional repression, and possibly subconscious psychic projection. These cases span decades, countries, and cultures, but they shared one thread: a focus on emotion, and often a troubled or vulnerable individual at the centre. Each case invites us to ask the same fundamental question: is this the work of spirits or the mind reaching out in ways that we don't yet understand? Think about how different these cases are. Different countries, decades, languages, yet they share the emotional pattern. What's more frightening, the idea of an angry ghost, or the idea that our minds can cause this? Before we explore emotional and psychic theories, it's important to understand the conventional explanations for poltergeist phenomena. These fall into three primary camps, and they all share one thing in common. They treat the cause as external to the individual experiencing the activity. So, number one, the spiritual theory. This is the most familiar explanation that poltergeists are intelligent external entities. Some believe they're spirits of the dead stuck between worlds, angry or confused. Others suggest the presence could be demonic, elemental, or even non-human intelligence that feeds on fear or emotional turmoil. In this framework, the activity is considered intentional. That means the knocking, object movement, or electrical interference isn't random. It's seen as a form of communication, or in some cases, a form of oppression. This theory is deeply embedded in religious, spiritualist, and even pop culture belief systems. It's easy to understand why it's a go-to explanation, especially when the activity seems responsive or aware, like answering knocks or using spirit boxes to give relevant answers. But while it's compelling, this theory lacks measurable evidence. It explains what is happening, but struggles to prove who is behind it or why. Second is fraud and misidentification. This is the default position of most skeptics. They argue that poltergeist cases are either outright hoaxes, especially when adolescents are involved, or natural phenomena being misread. Historically, teenage girls have often been the focus of these accusations, particularly in high-profile cases like Enfield, where Janet Hodgson was accused of faking the activity for attention. While some incidents were admitted hoax, many found and were witnessed by independent observers, which muddies the narrative. Skeptics also emphasize misinterpretation: creaking pipes mistaken for footsteps, doors slamming due to drafts, lights flickering caused by faulty wiring, rats or birds in the wall, vibrations from heavy traffic shaking furniture, and even shared psychological suggestion or mass hysteria in families under stress. This theory relies on rational destruction, and in some cases it absolutely applies. But many cases go far beyond what these natural explanations can account for, particularly when multiple witnesses are involved or when activity is captured on film or audio. The next one is environmental or natural causes. This is a more nuanced, skeptical theory, one that doesn't dismiss the phenomena, but suggests that unusual activity and environmental conditions may be to blame. Some researchers believe that certain geographic areas, often called window areas, produce heightened electromagnetic fields, underground water flow, or seismic microtremors. These may not just disturb the environment physically, but could affect human perception, even inducing hallucinations or emotional responses. So, for example, EMF exposure has been linked in some studies to feelings of anxiety or dread. Water tables moving beneath old foundations can cause vibrations and pressure shifts. Geomagnetic fields can interfere with electronic devices and brainwave patterns. So, in this theory, the haunting isn't paranormal. is a kind of natural illusion caused by environmental noise that the brain interprets as supernatural. It's compelling, but like the others, it focuses exclusively on external causes. And that's the key pattern here. All of these traditional theories, whether spiritual, skeptical, or scientific, assume that the activity is happening to the person. But what if that's backwards? What if the disturbances don't come from the environment but from the individual? What if poltergeist activity isn't a message from the dead, but a signal from the psyche, from the living person at the center of it? And here's something important to acknowledge. Too often in this field, we get stuck in a tug of war between believers and skeptics, one side insisting it's all spirits, the other side saying it's all fake. But that binary debate can distract us from the better question. What is this experience trying to tell us? Whether it's a ghost, a hoax, or a psychic reaction, the more interesting question is, why does this activity happen the way it does, around the people it does, in the moments it does? We don't need to take sides to ask better questions. We just need to look deeper. And that leads us to one of the most fascinating and controversial ideas in the entire field, and one that I covered off in a previous episode: recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. One of the most compelling non-spiritual theories for poltergeist activity is recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, or RSPK. Coined and explored by Dr. William G. Roll, RSPK suggests that the disturbances we associate with poltergeists, moving objects, knocking, electrical interference, are not caused by spirits at all, but by unconscious psychic energy projected by a living person. Roll argued that, in many cases, the activity centers around an individual, often referred to as the agent, who is under emotional or psychological stress, but may be unaware that they're the source of the disturbance. The phenomena are recurrent because they come in waves, often tied to episodes of heightened tension, and spontaneous because they're involuntary, not consciously controlled. One of the most consistent patterns in poltergeist cases is the presence of emotional turbulence, particularly among young people. Adolescents, especially teenage girls, are frequently identified as the focus of poltergeist activity. This isn't just a trope, it's statistically significant across many case studies. But it's not limited to teens. Adults going through divorce, grief, abuse, trauma, or major life upheavals can also be associated with activity spikes. Emotional energy, especially repressed or unexpressed emotion, is seen as in RSPK theory as building pressure, eventually discharging as kinetic force, seemingly causing physical effects in the environment. A house or building isn't just bricks and mortar, it holds emotional residue, a kind of psychic imprint from those who live there. When the environment is already unstable through domestic conflict, mental health struggles, or grief, it becomes a hotbed for poltergeist like phenomena. Think of it like a pressure cooker. Emotional energy builds up in a closed system, and when it has nowhere else to go, it explodes outward in unpredictable ways. Take the Enfield poltergeist. Whilst it's often viewed through a spiritual lens, it's worth noting that the activity centered around Janet, a young girl in a fractured home with an absent father and emotional turmoil. Some researchers have interpreted that this case is now a classic example of RSPK. As researchers, we must not ask just what happened, but also what emotional conditions surrounded the phenomena. In doing so, we move from ghost hunting to something deeper, understanding the emotional architecture of the paranormal. How many people right now are suffering emotionally and have no language to express it? What if this is how it leaks out? Imagine a teenager today isolated, traumatized, and ignored, surrounded by smart tech and under surveillance. What would their poltergeist look like? Building on the RSPK theory, let's go deeper into the idea of grief and emotional repression. Many poltergeist cases coincide with significant personal loss, the death of a loved one, the breakup of a family unit, or the trauma of abuse and neglect. What if the activity is not haunting, but a manifestation of unexpressed grief? Grief is a profound emotional state that affects not just the mind, but the body. It can disrupt sleep, digestion, memory. So it's not far-fetched to suggest that it might affect a person's energy field or psychic output. There are cases where disturbances began shortly after the death in a family and ceased once the grief was acknowledged and processed. In the Shadow Man case, the figure appeared after the loss of Julian's father and returned more intensely following his mother's death, a clear example of emotional collapse potentially manifesting in environment. What makes this case even more compelling is that others in Julian's life saw the same figure, suggesting the phenomena was external, but possibly rooted in his emotional state. This case raises big questions. Are poltergeist cases sometimes echoes of grief? Are they psychic cries when words and tears are not enough? If grief can project psychic and physical phenomena, voice, movement, presence, then investigating a poltergeist case could also be about offering emotional closure, not just data. Take a moment to consider, what pain are we surrounded by that's never been spoken aloud? Let's now examine the role of a living person in the poltergeist phenomena. If we accept the theory of RSPK, that psychic energy can unconsciously influence a physical world, then we must also accept a difficult truth. In some cases, the person experiencing the haunting is also the source of it. This repositions poltergeists not as spirits of the dead, but as the emotional projections of the living. And it's important to be clear these individuals aren't faking. They're not performing for attention. What they're doing is far more complex and unconscious. They're externalizing internal conflict, pressure that builds up emotionally or psychologically and has no other outlet. They become the emotional pressure valves, and the poltergeist is released. This concept overlaps with PSI theory, the idea that the mind can influence matter, psychokinesis, and even Carl Jung's concept of the shadow self, the hidden, repressed aspects of the psyche that we bury until they break through. When we talk about a mind-body environment loop, we're also referring to a feedback system where mental and emotional states affect the body's condition influences thought and emotions, and the environment, including physical surroundings, social dynamics, and even atmospheric conditions, affects both. Now, in the context of a poltergeist phenomena, here's how it may work. The mind. A person experiences repressed emotion, trauma, grief, or unprocessed psychological stress. This might be subconscious, they're not always aware it's there. The body. That emotional energy translates into psychological and physiological tension. Heart rate increases, muscle tighten, cortisol spikes. The body becomes a pressure vessel. And the environment. In some cases, what emotional energy is believed to leak or discharge into the environment, triggering what we observe as poltergeist activity, objects moving, knocks in the walls, and tech malfunctions. And here's the kicker. When the environment responds, for example, a bang occurs right after an emotional argument, the person becomes more anxious or fearful, which fuels the stress, and the loop continues. This model helps explain why poltergeist activity often happens around people under chronic emotional strain, peaks during conflict or emotional upheaval, and stops when the agent is removed from the environment. It also calms down when emotional resolution takes place, therapy, relocation, family reconciliation. So, in an investigation, if you walk into a space that's emotionally charged from grief, tension, trauma, and you're only looking at EMF spikes, you're missing the bigger system at play. So instead of asking, what's haunting this person, we might ask instead, what pain are they carrying that's trying to be seen? It changes the narrative. Instead of fearing poltergeists, maybe we should start listening to what they're trying to express, because sometimes the phenomena are messages from the other side. They're unspoken emotions breaking the surface. This perspective humanizes the paranormal. It reminds us that the most haunted thing in the room might be someone's heart. That's just a brief take on the emotional trauma behind a poltergeist manifestation. I won't go into the rest because this is part of an ongoing talk and written document that I'm working on that talks around emotional triggers and manifestations of the person rather than a paranormal event. And whilst it is deemed as paranormal and should be seen to a certain extent as paranormal, the initial cause, the source, the the beginning of the poltergeist activity is a lot closer to home. Thanks for listening.